The question came from the most unexpected place, a funeral home parking lot where I was sitting in my car, trying to process what I had just witnessed. But what Jesus revealed to me about cremation will stun you, because his answer had nothing to do with what I expected, and everything to do with something far more important that the church has completely missed. And what makes his answer so shocking is not whether cremation blocks heaven, but what our obsession with this question reveals about our faith. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now let's get into my story. So, I was sitting in this funeral home parking lot in Phoenix, and I had just attended the memorial service for a friend's father. The family had chosen cremation, and during the reception afterward, I overheard a conversation that honestly made my stomach turn. Two older women from the church were standing near the refreshment table, and one of them said, she actually said this out loud, "It's such a shame they chose cremation. Now he might not make it to heaven. The Bible says we need our bodies for the resurrection." The other woman nodded seriously and said, "I've told my children, whatever you do, don't cremate me. I want to make sure I can be resurrected when Jesus comes back." And I stood there with my coffee, trying to process what I was hearing. These were sincere believers, genuinely concerned about their eternal destiny, basing major life decisions on a theological position that, well, I wasn't sure if it was even biblical. But more than that, something about the whole conversation felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. So I left the reception early and sat in my car, and I found myself praying. Actually, it was more like arguing with God. "Lord," I said, "people are genuinely worried about this. They're making decisions based on fear that cremation might somehow disqualify them from resurrection. Is there any truth to this? Does it actually matter?" I expected maybe some peace or a scripture to come to mind, or just, I don't know, something to help me answer the question. But what happened instead was so much more than I could have imagined. The parking lot didn't disappear, but suddenly I was experiencing two realities at once. I was still sitting in my car, but I was also in the presence of Jesus, and his expression was, how do I describe this? It was like he had been waiting for someone to finally ask this question so he could address something much bigger. "Jonathan," he said, and his voice had this quality of both patience and urgency, "I'm going to answer your question about cremation, but my answer is going to shock you, because the real issue isn't what you think it is." So I'm sitting there, gripping my steering wheel, and Jesus continues. The question, does cremation block heaven, reveals something deeply wrong with how my church understands salvation, resurrection, and what I actually care about. Tonight, I'm going to show you why this question matters, but not for the reasons anyone thinks. And then the vision started, and what I saw, it wasn't what I expected at all. I found myself observing believers across history, from the first century all the way to now, and I could see how they had died and what had happened to their bodies. Some were buried in tombs. Some were burned at the stake as martyrs. Some were eaten by wild animals in Roman arenas. Some were lost at sea. Some were cremated. Some were buried in mass graves. Some just decomposed naturally over centuries. And here's what stunned me. Jesus showed me that every single one of them, regardless of what happened to their physical bodies, was going to be resurrected. The martyrs who were burned alive, resurrected. The believers whose bodies were completely destroyed, resurrected. The ones who were cremated, resurrected. The ones who were buried traditionally, also resurrected. So, it doesn't matter? I asked, feeling both relieved and confused. Cremation doesn't block heaven? That's not the right question, Jesus replied, and there was something in his tone that made me realize I was missing the point entirely. The question isn't whether cremation blocks heaven. The question is, why are my people so focused on what happens to their dead bodies that they've missed what I care about regarding their living souls? And that's when the vision shifted, and I began to see something that honestly broke my heart. I watched as believers spent enormous amounts of time, energy, and emotional bandwidth worrying about cremation versus burial. They debated it in church meetings. They argued about it with family members. They made it a test of faithfulness. They judged others based on their choice. They created fear and anxiety around a decision that, according to Jesus, completely missed the point of what he was trying to teach them about resurrection and eternal life. "Look at this woman," Jesus said, directing my attention to an elderly believer I could see in the vision. She was lying awake at night, genuinely anxious about whether she should be cremated or buried. She had read articles arguing both sides. She had consulted pastors who gave her conflicting answers. She was losing sleep over this decision. But here's what made me want to cry. While she was obsessing over what would happen to her body after death, Jesus showed me that she was completely neglecting what was happening to her soul during life. She wasn't growing spiritually. She wasn't being transformed. She wasn't developing intimacy with Christ. She was so focused on the disposal of her dead body that she was ignoring the condition of her living soul. This is the real issue, Jesus explained, and I could hear the grief in his voice. My people are so concerned about whether their bodies will be intact for resurrection that they've forgotten that I'm the God who created bodies from dust in the first place. They're worried about whether I can resurrect them if they're cremated, as if my power is somehow limited by what humans do to dead flesh. And then he said something that it hit me like a punch to the chest. They're asking the wrong question because they're focused on the wrong thing. They should be asking, am I living in a way that prepares my soul for eternity? Instead, they're asking, what should I do with my body after I'm dead? The vision expanded, and I began to see the theological confusion that had created this whole debate. I saw how believers had taken scriptures about resurrection, beautiful, powerful promises about God's ability to raise the dead, and twisted them into anxieties about body disposal methods. Look at this pastor, Jesus said, showing me a church leader who was teaching his congregation that cremation was wrong because it showed a lack of faith in resurrection. The pastor was sincere, genuinely trying to help his people, but he was creating fear and judgment around an issue that Jesus was showing me was completely beside the point. This pastor means well, Jesus explained, but he's teaching my people to focus on the wrong thing. He's making them anxious about their bodies when I want them to be concerned about their souls. He's creating rules about death when I want them to focus on life. So I'm watching all this, and I'm starting to understand that Jesus' answer to my question about cremation was going to be way more complex and way more challenging than a simple yes or no. But Lord, I said, trying to process what I was seeing, people genuinely want to know. They're making decisions about their funerals, about their wills, about what to tell their families. They need a clear answer. Does cremation block heaven or not? And Jesus looked at me with this expression that was both loving and slightly exasperated, like a parent trying to explain something important to a child who keeps asking the wrong question. Jonathan, he said, if I simply tell you, no, cremation doesn't block heaven, people will miss the deeper issue I'm trying to address. If I say, it doesn't matter what you do with your body after death, they'll think I'm being dismissive of their concerns. But the truth is more important than either of those answers. The truth, he continued, is that the question itself reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am, what resurrection means, and what actually determines someone's eternal destiny. And that misunderstanding is causing my people to focus on the wrong things, to create unnecessary anxiety, and to miss what I'm actually calling them to. The vision began to intensify, and I could see that Jesus was about to show me something that would completely reframe how I understood not just cremation, but the entire way Christians think about death, resurrection, and eternal life. Tomorrow night, Jesus said, I'm going to show you what the cremation debate reveals about the church's misunderstanding of resurrection. I'm going to expose the theological confusion that has created this anxiety, and I'm going to reveal what I actually care about when it comes to your body, your death, and your eternal destiny. But before the vision faded, he said something that I knew would haunt me until our next encounter. The question, does cremation block heaven, is asked by people who don't understand the power of God, the nature of resurrection, or what actually determines eternal destiny. And their confusion about this reveals a much deeper problem in how the church has taught them to think about salvation itself. As I found myself fully back in the funeral home parking lot, still gripping my steering wheel, tears streaming down my face, I realized that Jesus hadn't given me a simple answer because there wasn't a simple answer. Or rather, the simple answer, no, cremation doesn't block heaven, would have missed the entire point of what he was trying to teach. The real issue wasn't cremation versus burial. The real issue was that believers were so focused on what happened to their bodies after death that they were neglecting what was happening to their souls during life. They were so anxious about whether God could resurrect cremated remains that they had forgotten that God created the entire universe from nothing. And honestly, I realized I had been asking the wrong question too. I had wanted a clear theological answer about cremation when Jesus wanted to address something far more important: the way Christians think about death, resurrection, and what actually matters for eternity. So I sat there in that parking lot, and I knew that tomorrow night's vision was going to challenge everything I thought I understood about resurrection. Because if Jesus was right, and of course he was right, then the entire cremation debate was a distraction from what he actually cared about. The question that haunted me as I finally started my car and drove home was this: if the cremation debate reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of God's power and resurrection, what else are Christians getting wrong? Because they're asking the wrong questions and focusing on the wrong things. The second night brought revelations that exposed what the cremation debate actually reveals about how Christians misunderstand resurrection, God's power, and salvation itself. After Jesus showed me that believers were asking the wrong question, I spent the entire day unable to stop thinking about all the theological confusion that had created this anxiety in the first place. What Jesus would show me about why this question even exists would prove that the problem was way deeper than anyone realized. So, I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those two women at the funeral, genuinely worried that cremation might somehow prevent resurrection. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how many Christians I knew who had similar concerns, not just about cremation, but about all sorts of things related to their bodies and the afterlife. At exactly 2:34 a.m., I remember looking at my clock and thinking how random that time was, my bedroom filled with that overwhelming presence. Jesus was there, and his expression carried this mixture of compassion and frustration, like he was about to address a misunderstanding that had been causing unnecessary pain for way too long. "Tonight," he said, and his voice had this quality of a teacher who was finally going to correct a fundamental error, "I'm going to show you what the cremation debate reveals about how my church misunderstands resurrection. And Jonathan, what you're about to see will expose theological confusion that goes far beyond just this one question." The room dissolved, and I found myself observing what looked like, I don't know how to describe it. It was like I could see into the minds of believers across history who had worried about their bodies and resurrection. And what I saw was honestly heartbreaking. The first thing the cremation debate reveals, Jesus explained, is that my people have forgotten who I am and what I'm capable of. They're worried about whether I can resurrect a cremated body, as if my power is somehow limited by what humans do to dead flesh. I watched as this played out in the concerns of countless believers. They genuinely believed that God, the God who created the universe from nothing, who formed Adam from dust, who raised Jesus from the dead, might somehow be stumped by cremation. Like, they thought that God would get to the resurrection and be like, "Oh no, this person was cremated. I guess I can't resurrect them now." "Look at this man," Jesus said, showing me a believer who was adamant that burial was the only biblical option. He was teaching a Sunday school class, and he said, he actually said this: God needs our bodies to be intact for the resurrection. Cremation destroys the body, so it makes resurrection impossible. And I wanted to interrupt the vision and ask this guy, "Do you realize what you're saying about God's power? Do you understand that you're claiming the creator of the universe is limited by human cremation technology? This reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am," Jesus explained, and I could hear the sadness in his voice. "They've made me so small in their minds that they think I need intact bodies to work with. They've forgotten that I created bodies from dust in the first place, that I can speak worlds into existence, that nothing is impossible for me." The second thing the cremation debate revealed was even more troubling. "The second thing this debate reveals," Jesus continued, "is that my people have a completely wrong understanding of what resurrection actually means. They think resurrection is about reassembling the same physical atoms, like putting together a puzzle. But that's not what resurrection is at all." So he showed me what resurrection actually involves, and honestly, it was nothing like what I had been taught. I watched as he explained that resurrection wasn't about gathering up the exact same molecules that made up someone's earthly body. Think about it. Those molecules are constantly changing throughout life anyway. People who lived centuries ago, their bodies have completely decomposed, and those atoms have been recycled into the earth, into plants, into other living things. "Observe these martyrs," Jesus said, showing me believers who had been burned at the stake in the first century. Their bodies were completely destroyed by fire, way more thoroughly than modern cremation. Do you think I cannot resurrect them because their bodies were burned? Do you think I'm standing at the resurrection saying, sorry, you were burned too completely. I can't bring you back? And then he showed me something that it blew my mind. He showed me believers who had been lost at sea, whose bodies were eaten by fish, believers who had been killed by wild animals, believers whose bodies had decomposed naturally over centuries until there was literally nothing left but scattered atoms that had been absorbed into the ecosystem. If resurrection required the exact same physical atoms, Jesus explained, then none of these people could be resurrected, but I'm not limited by human understanding of how bodies work. Resurrection is about me, creating a new body, a glorified, eternal body, not about reassembling the old one. The third revelation was where things got really uncomfortable. The third thing the cremation debate reveals, Jesus said, and his voice took on this tone of particular concern, is that my people are more focused on their dead bodies than on their living souls. They're obsessing over what happens after death while ignoring what's happening before death. I watched as believers spent enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy on the cremation question. They researched it, debated it, worried about it, made it a point of doctrine. But while they were focused on this, Jesus showed me what they were neglecting. Look at this woman, he said, directing my attention to someone who had spent hours researching whether cremation was biblical. She had read articles, consulted commentaries, asked her pastor. She was determined to make the right decision about her body after death. But here's what made me want to cry. While she was obsessing over cremation, she wasn't growing spiritually. She wasn't being transformed. She wasn't developing intimacy with Christ. She wasn't serving others. She wasn't sharing her faith. She was so focused on what would happen to her body after she died that she was wasting the life she had before she died. This is the tragedy, Jesus explained. My people are so concerned about their dead bodies that they're neglecting their living souls. They're asking, what should I do with my body after death, when they should be asking, what should I do with my life before death? The fourth thing the cremation debate revealed was even more disturbing. The fourth thing this reveals, Jesus continued, is that my people have turned salvation into a checklist of rules rather than a relationship with me. They think that making the right choice about cremation is part of earning or maintaining their salvation. So I watched as this played out in churches across the world. Believers who thought that choosing burial over cremation was a sign of faithfulness. Churches that taught cremation was wrong, making it a test of orthodoxy. Families that judged each other based on funeral choices. Observe this church, Jesus said, showing me a congregation where the pastor had taught that cremation was sinful. The members of this church genuinely believed that choosing cremation would jeopardize their salvation. They had turned a non-issue into a salvation issue. And here's what was so heartbreaking. These were sincere believers who loved God and wanted to honor Him. But they had been taught that honoring God meant following rules about body disposal rather than being transformed by relationship with Him. This reveals how far my church has drifted from understanding grace. Jesus explained, they've turned salvation into a checklist. Believe the right things, do the right things, avoid the wrong things, and make sure your body is disposed of correctly. But salvation has never been about checking boxes, it's about relationship with me. The fifth thing the cremation debate revealed was the most shocking of all. The fifth thing this reveals, Jesus said, his voice now carrying the weight of something really important, is that my people don't actually trust me. They say they believe in my power, but their anxiety about cremation reveals that they don't really believe I can do what I've promised. I watched as believers who claimed to have faith in God's power were paralyzed by fear about cremation. They said they believed God could do anything, but they were genuinely worried that cremation might be the one thing that could thwart His plans. Look at this man, Jesus said, showing me someone who was lying awake at night, anxious about whether he should be cremated or buried. He prayed about it constantly, asking God for guidance, but he couldn't find peace. But here's what Jesus showed me. This man's anxiety wasn't really about cremation, it was about trust. Deep down, he didn't really believe that God was powerful enough, loving enough, or faithful enough to resurrect him regardless of what happened to his body. This is what the cremation debate ultimately reveals, Jesus explained, a lack of trust in who I am and what I've promised. If my people truly believed in my power, they wouldn't be anxious about cremation. If they truly understood resurrection, they wouldn't think it depended on body disposal methods. If they truly trusted me, they would rest in my promises, rather than creating rules to try to guarantee their resurrection. As Jesus revealed these 5 things, misunderstanding God's power, misunderstanding resurrection, focusing on dead bodies instead of living souls, turning salvation into a checklist, and lacking trust, I began to see that the cremation debate was just a symptom of much deeper problems in how Christians understood their faith. But Jesus, I said, trying to process everything I was seeing, if the cremation debate reveals all these misunderstandings, what's the actual answer? I mean, should Christians be cremated or buried? Does it matter at all? And Jesus looked at me with this expression that was both patient and slightly amused, like he knew I was still trying to get a simple answer to a question that required a more complex response. Jonathan, he said, the answer to whether cremation blocks heaven is simple. No, it doesn't. I can resurrect anyone regardless of what happened to their body. But if I just give you that simple answer, people will miss everything I'm trying to teach them through this question. The real issue, he continued, isn't cremation versus burial. The real issue is that my people have created anxiety around a non-issue while ignoring the actual issues I care about. They're worried about body disposal when they should be concerned about soul transformation. They're focused on death when I want them to focus on life. They're trying to guarantee resurrection through the right burial method when resurrection is guaranteed by faith in me. So I'm sitting there in this vision, and I'm starting to realize that Jesus' answer to the cremation question was going to challenge way more than just funeral planning. It was going to challenge how Christians think about salvation, resurrection, God's power, and what actually matters for eternity. Tomorrow night, Jesus said as the vision began to fade, I'm going to show you what I actually care about when it comes to your body, your death, and your resurrection. I'm going to reveal what questions you should be asking instead of worrying about cremation. And I'm going to expose what really determines your eternal destiny, and it has nothing to do with how your body is disposed of after death. But before the vision ended completely, he said something that I knew would change how I thought about this entire issue. The cremation debate exists because my people are asking the wrong questions. They're focused on what happens to their bodies after death when I want them focused on what's happening to their souls before death. They're worried about whether I can resurrect them when they should be concerned about whether they're living in a way that makes them ready for resurrection. As I found myself back in my bedroom, the weight of what Jesus had revealed pressed down on me. The cremation debate wasn't really about cremation at all. It was about 5 fundamental misunderstandings that were causing believers to focus on the wrong things, create unnecessary anxiety, and miss what Jesus actually cared about. And honestly, I realized that I had been part of the problem. I had treated the cremation question as a legitimate theological debate when Jesus was showing me it was a distraction from what actually mattered. I had been asking, does cremation block heaven? When I should have been asking, am I living in a way that prepares me for heaven? The question that haunted me was both personal and urgent. If the cremation debate reveals these 5 fundamental misunderstandings about God's power, resurrection, priorities, salvation, and trust, what should Christians actually be focused on instead? And what does Jesus really care about when it comes to our bodies, our deaths, and our eternal destiny? The third night brought the revelation that would finally answer my question, but in a way that would challenge everything Christians believe about death, resurrection, and what actually matters for eternity. After Jesus exposed what the cremation debate revealed about our misunderstandings, I spent the entire day wrestling with a new question. If cremation doesn't matter, then what does? What Jesus would show me about what he actually cares about would prove more challenging and more liberating than any simple answer about burial methods. So, I spent that whole day just, feeling kind of unsettled, because on one hand I was relieved that Jesus had basically said cremation doesn't block heaven, but on the other hand I kept thinking about those 5 misunderstandings he had exposed, and I realized that if we were getting the cremation question wrong, we were probably getting a lot of other things wrong too. At exactly 2:34 a.m., same time as the night before, my bedroom filled with that presence again, but this time Jesus' expression was different. There was this sense of eager anticipation, like he had been waiting to share something important, something that would finally redirect our focus from the wrong questions to the right ones. Tonight, he said, and his voice carried both authority and tenderness. I'm going to show you what I actually care about when it comes to your body, your death, and your resurrection. And Jonathan, what you're about to learn will free my people from anxiety about cremation and redirect them toward what actually matters for eternity. The room dissolved, and I found myself in this place that was like, it was like I could see both time and eternity at once. I could see believers living their lives, dying their deaths, and experiencing resurrection. And Jesus was about to show me what he was actually paying attention to through all of it. The first thing I actually care about, Jesus explained, is not what happens to your body after death, but what happens to your soul before death. I care about whether you're being transformed into my likeness while you're alive. So he showed me two believers, let me call them Sarah and Michael. Sarah had spent years worrying about whether she should be cremated or buried. She had researched it extensively, made her wishes clear to her family, and felt confident she had made the right choice for resurrection. But while she was focused on this, Jesus showed me that her soul was stagnant. She wasn't growing spiritually, she wasn't being transformed, she was the same person she had been 10 years ago. Michael, on the other hand, had never even thought about the cremation question. He figured God would handle the resurrection part, so why worry about it? But what Michael was focused on was being transformed by Christ every single day. He was becoming more loving, more patient, more like Jesus. His soul was being prepared for eternity through daily transformation. When they both died, Jesus said, Sarah was buried according to her carefully planned wishes, and Michael was cremated because that's what his family chose. But at the resurrection, the method of body disposal was completely irrelevant. What mattered was the condition of their souls. And then Jesus showed me something that it hit me so hard. At the resurrection, both Sarah and Michael received glorified bodies, perfect, eternal, incorruptible. But Sarah's soul was unprepared for the intimacy of heaven because she had spent her life focused on the wrong things. Michael's soul was ready because he had spent his life being transformed. This is what I actually care about, Jesus explained. Not whether you're cremated or buried, but whether you're being transformed while you're alive. Your body disposal method has zero impact on your resurrection, but your soul's condition has everything to do with your readiness for eternity. The second thing Jesus cared about was equally challenging. The second thing I actually care about, he continued, is not the preservation of your dead body, but the surrender of your living body as a living sacrifice to me. So he showed me believers who were meticulous about planning their funerals, making sure their bodies would be treated with respect after death. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But Jesus showed me that many of these same believers had never surrendered their living bodies to him. Look at this woman, Jesus said, showing me someone who had very specific wishes about her burial. She wanted to be buried in a particular cemetery, in a particular plot, with a particular headstone. She had it all planned out because she wanted her body to be honored after death. But here's what broke my heart. While she was so concerned about honoring her dead body, she wasn't honoring God with her living body. She wasn't using her body to serve others. She wasn't presenting her body as a living sacrifice. She was keeping her body comfortable, safe, and focused on her own desires. I don't care about what you do with your dead body, Jesus explained, and his voice had this quality of gentle frustration. I care about what you do with your living body. Romans 12:1 says to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, that's what matters. Whether you're cremated or buried after death is irrelevant compared to whether you've surrendered your body to me during life. The third thing Jesus cared about was something I had never really considered. The third thing I actually care about, Jesus said, is not your anxiety about resurrection, but your trust in my promises. I care about whether you believe I'm powerful enough and faithful enough to do what I've said I'll do. He showed me believers who were consumed with anxiety about all sorts of things related to death and resurrection. Not just cremation, but also questions like, what if my body is destroyed in an accident? What if I'm lost at sea? What if I donate my organs? What if I'm buried in the wrong place? What if? All of these anxieties, Jesus explained, reveal a fundamental lack of trust in who I am. They're worried about whether I can resurrect them under various circumstances, as if my power has limitations. But I'm the God who created the universe from nothing. I'm the God who formed Adam from dust. I'm the God who raised myself from the dead. Do they really think cremation is going to be a problem for me? And then he said something that it cut right to the heart of the issue. When my people are anxious about cremation, they're not really worried about cremation. They're revealing that they don't trust me. And what I care about is not their burial method. I care about whether they trust me enough to rest in my promises. The fourth thing Jesus cared about was both convicting and liberating. The fourth thing I actually care about, he continued, is not whether you follow rules about body disposal, but whether you're living in relationship with me. I care about intimacy, not regulations. So he showed me churches that had created rules about cremation, some saying it was wrong, others saying it was fine, but all of them treating it as a matter of doctrine that needed to be regulated. And Jesus showed me that this whole approach missed the point of what Christianity was supposed to be. Look at this church, he said, showing me a congregation that had an official policy against cremation. They taught that faithful Christians should be buried, not cremated. They made it a test of orthodoxy, a sign of whether someone really trusted in resurrection. But here's what Jesus revealed. While this church was focused on regulating body disposal, they were neglecting relationship. Their Christianity had become about following rules rather than knowing Christ. They had turned faith into a checklist of do's and don'ts, and cremation had become just another item on the list. I didn't die to give you a list of rules about body disposal, Jesus explained, and I could hear both sadness and passion in his voice. I died to give you relationship with me. I care about whether you know me, whether you love me, whether you're walking with me daily. The cremation question is a distraction from what actually matters: intimacy with me. The fifth thing Jesus cared about was the most important of all. The fifth thing I actually care about, Jesus said, his voice now carrying the weight of eternal significance, is not how your body is disposed of after death, but whether your soul is ready for eternity. I care about whether you've been born again, whether you've been transformed by my Spirit, whether you're living in faith and obedience. He showed me the moment of death for countless believers, some who were buried, some who were cremated, some whose bodies were destroyed in various ways. And what I saw was stunning. At the moment of death, the method of body disposal was completely irrelevant. What mattered was the condition of the soul. Observe these two men, Jesus said, showing me two believers who died on the same day. One was buried in an expensive casket in a beautiful cemetery. The other was cremated and his ashes were scattered at sea. The first man had spent his life focused on external religion, going to church, following rules, maintaining his reputation as a good Christian. He had made sure his burial would be biblical because he thought that mattered for resurrection. But his soul was unprepared for eternity because he had never truly been born again. He had religion, but he didn't have relationship. The second man had spent his life in genuine relationship with me. He had been transformed by my Spirit. He had grown in love, faith, and obedience. He never worried about cremation because he trusted me completely. And his soul was ready for eternity because he had been born again and was being sanctified. At the resurrection, Jesus explained, both men received glorified bodies because I'm powerful enough to resurrect anyone regardless of what happened to their earthly body. But only the second man was ready for the intimacy of heaven because his soul had been prepared through relationship with me. As Jesus revealed these 5 things, he actually cared about soul transformation before death, surrender of living bodies, trust in his promises, relationship over regulations, and readiness of soul for eternity. I began to understand why he had been so reluctant to just give me a simple yes or no answer about cremation. So, I said, trying to make sure I understood, you're saying that cremation doesn't block heaven, but that's not really the point. The point is that we're asking the wrong question entirely. Exactly, Jesus replied, and there was this sense of relief in his voice, like I had finally gotten it. The cremation question is a distraction. It's like asking whether the color of your car affects your destination. The answer is no, it doesn't, but the fact that you're asking reveals that you're focused on the wrong thing. What I care about, he continued, is whether your soul is being transformed, whether you're surrendering your living body to me, whether you trust my promises, whether you're living in relationship with me, and whether you're ready for eternity. Those are the questions that matter. Cremation versus burial is completely irrelevant to all of them. As the vision began to fade and I found myself back in my bedroom, Jesus spoke one final time, and his words would change how I thought about death, resurrection, and eternity forever. Tell my people to stop obsessing over cremation and start focusing on transformation. Tell them to stop worrying about their dead bodies and start surrendering their living bodies. Tell them to stop creating anxiety about resurrection and start trusting my promises. Tell them to stop making rules about body disposal and start pursuing relationship with me. Tell them to stop asking, does cremation block heaven? And start asking, is my soul ready for heaven? And tell them this, he concluded, his voice carrying both authority and love. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. That promise has nothing to do with cremation or burial. It has everything to do with faith in me. As his presence faded, I was left with the most liberating truth I had ever encountered about death and resurrection. Cremation doesn't block heaven, not because of some technicality or loophole, but because resurrection has never been about body disposal methods. It's about God's power, God's promises, and God's ability to raise the dead regardless of what happened to their earthly bodies. The question, does cremation block heaven, reveals that we're focused on the wrong things. We're worried about what happens to our bodies after death when Jesus cares about what's happening to our souls before death. We're anxious about whether God can resurrect us when we should be trusting that He will. We're creating rules about body disposal when we should be pursuing relationship with Christ. So here's the stunning answer to the cremation question. No, cremation doesn't block heaven, but the fact that we're asking reveals that we've missed what actually matters. Jesus doesn't care whether you're cremated or buried. He cares whether you're being transformed, whether you're surrendering your life to Him, whether you trust His promises, whether you're living in relationship with Him, and whether your soul is ready for eternity. Stop worrying about cremation. Start focusing on transformation. That's what Jesus actually cares about. And that's what will determine your readiness for resurrection. Not the disposal method of your dead body, but the condition of your living soul.